different, well, maybe not so different, taste of data from the perspective of London in the United Kingdom.
I wasn't expecting it to be this formal. I was told it was a chat.
It's a chat. It is a chat.
And I was told that, well, I thought we'd be in a room of about 20 people. So, yeah, I've been done, I think, is the thing. London has a database, and it had a database for a very, very long time. And it is a by name list database. So I'm going to talk you through some of the ways that London counts. We're obsessed with data. We have a by name list database. We also have a number of other tools with which we capture data in London. I'm going to talk you through some of those. And when Paul says I'm here to offer a different perspective, I'm not here to say that you don't have to do a registry week, but please do it like us or anything like that. So I'm not going to give you the right answer by any stretch of the imagination. I'm purely going to talk through the experience that we've had in London of delivering on this data and some of the issues that we have with it. So I'm going to be quite honest. And please don't over-tweet my honesty if you're tweeting, because I will be quite honest about some of the issues that we've had with it. And I think we were one of the people that raised our hands when we said we'd like to do a registry week, because I think for us, one of the things about having an ongoing data list is actually about thinking about how you continually improve it. And if nothing else, I think the registry week for us will really help focus us on the way that we use data better. And improve our data. So I'm just going to give you a tiny bit of background as to why we have the list. And we have a vision in London around ending rough sleeping. Actually, we have a vision across the country in England actually around ending rough sleeping. And when we talk about ending rough sleeping, we give it 4 definitions of our own. And these were agreed by the Mayor's Rough Sleeping Group, which is a group of NGOs and local authorities, as well as the Greater London Authority. And we came together to create these 4 terms, which for us is an end to rough sleeping in London. And the first one is no second night out. And that's a very, very assertive approach to the minute we see somebody on the street. So the first time we see somebody on the street, if we see them there the next day, the second day, and they don't look like they're going anywhere, the idea is we pick them up straight away. The next one is that nobody lives on the streets, and that's about working with people who are entrenched. So people that have stayed on the streets, that have created a street identity for themselves. I think probably what we're calling here chronic homeless people, so the people that don't really see themselves as anywhere else. So issues around tackling that. Big issue for us in London is that nobody arrives on the streets, so prevention. It's all right having all of these fantastic services and interventions to get people off the streets, but wouldn't it just be lovely if they didn't feel like they needed to turn up in the first place? And then a particular issue for us in London, and I think one that we'd hope to sort out possibly through this process, is the number of people we have returning to the streets. And that's people that come onto our streets and we get them a place in a hostel, and then we get them a place in housing, and we don't deal with a lot of the needs that caused them to become homeless in the first place. So they come back to us, and we measure all of those things. So I've given you those definitions now, not just to sort of wax lyrical about London's definitions of rough sleeping, but because actually our database then refers back to those definitions and how we're doing with them. So our database is called Chain, and we also do a point-in-time count, which I'll talk briefly about, and we also have something called StreetLink, which is emerging as a sort of challenger to Chain, if you like. It's not attempting to do what Chain does, but it is questioning some of the data on Chain because it takes it from a different source. So it's just a slightly interesting one. So, what's Chain? Because this is the main bit. So Chain stands for Combined Homelessness and Information Network. So that's where we get the chain from. In England, we don't call things complicated things like the VI Act. We'd never do that. We always make everything into words. So we have a whole process for move on that we call the MOP, which is a move on protocol. We have a prevention one called Prompt. We love them. But this case is Chain. And what that is, it's a multi-agency database. It does what it says on the tin, for recording information about rough sleepers and the wider street population in London. And it's the most comprehensive one we have in the country, and it collects a huge amount of information over a very long period of time for people, so it doesn't let go of them at the point where they leave the streets. It continues to track them through a range of different services. Importantly, it's commissioned, so it's funded. It's not just something that some of us decided to do one day, but it's actually a central part of the commitment to ending rough sleeping by the Greater London Authority, and is commissioned through their central commissioning process. And it's currently run by an organisation called St Mungo's Broadway, who are a large service provider in London, and my colleague sitting over there, who's with me, is from that very company. And what Chain does, and what it's designed to do, is it's to allow people to share data. That's its main thing. So we produce lots and lots of aggregate data from Chain, but one of the key things about Chain is that it allows workers to see what other workers have done. So that actually what we don't do is go and see somebody on an outreach shift on a Friday and be told a whole range of things and ask people questions and sort something out for them, and then go and see them again the following Monday, and it's a different worker, and that worker doesn't understand what's gone on. So it's a record of action ongoingly, and it's to ensure that we don't duplicate efforts, is the sort of nice reason to do it, if I'm really honest as well. It's to make sure we're not being played, and that people aren't service shopping and saying, oh no, they never offered me that help, oh no, that's never been available. We know it has been, because quite often part of the work that we need to do is challenge as well as support. So that's what the Chain database does. So what does it record? This is the bit that's sort of just the basic stuff. It records identity and demographic information. Most importantly, it records contacts made with outreach workers, where and when people were bedded down, when they're not bedded down. It also records arrivals and departures onto the streets, which allows us to do that whole thing about understanding new rough sleepers, or whether people have been living on the streets for some time, or whether they've returned to the streets after a period of leaving the streets. And it gives us a basic understanding of the needs that people have. So we're able to break down the population in London by looking at the number of people that say have a mental health problem or a drug problem and things like that. And that allows us then to talk to services both on an individual level, so you as an outreach worker using the Chain data to say, actually my client needs X, Y and Z, but also for us to go then back to the Greater London Authority and say, actually your drug services aren't working, or your mental health services aren't accessible to our client group. It's a range of people can input onto the database, and this is one of the great things about the database, is that actually, unlike many systems where actually what you're doing is recording and recording and recording, and then actually what you've got is some poor person sitting in an office, tearing their hair out, trying to just input sets upon sets upon sets of anonymous data. Outreach workers and other people that work in the homelessness sector directly input into the database system themselves. So they have a unique login, a unique password, and they can go into the database and say, I saw this client. Each client has a unique identifier number, so that you're recording things against the right client. And you're also seeing then the other actions that people have put in there. It's a range of different people, so it's the outreach teams that can record, it's people at our rough sleeper assessment hubs, which we call our No Second Night Out services, which are almost like our triage for rough sleeper services, if you like. All of our accommodation projects continue, particularly to put exit data on, and also day centres and some other specialist services that see lots of rough sleepers have Chain access. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, and for as many people that do have access to input onto Chain, there are as many people queuing up saying, but I saw a rough sleeper last Thursday and I would have really loved to have put that down. So I think it's a real balance for our colleagues at St Mungo's Broadway actually to establish a wide enough access to the database to allow people to input themselves, but at the same time maintain the security of the database, so there isn't a whole load of people just willfully just throwing information into the mix and making it impossible to use. And then the confidentiality issue, who can see the database, and that's really important. People working in one or more of the London boroughs, so you have to be a member of staff, you can't be a member of the public to look at the Chain database, and you have to be a member of staff working with rough sleepers across one or more authority in London, or working closely with their local outreach teams. There is some access for specialist services that work around rough sleeping, but only limited access. Anybody in a specialist service that works directly with rough sleepers on a regular basis, so that's some of the specialist drug and health services, can have access to the Chain database. And we also have dashboard access then for people that do work that's relevant to rough sleeping. So for instance, the Mayor's office who commissioned this, for instance, it's a really good example actually, so the Mayor of London pays for this, wouldn't have granular access to the database, can't log in and say, I saw somebody outside City Hall, I'm going to just look at their background and have a bit of a moan about it. But of course the Greater London Authority actually can have access then to the dashboard information that's available. So that's how that's who can see it. This is how we analyse it. So this is the important bit about how we see rough sleepers in terms of new rough sleepers, people living on the streets and people returning to the streets. And we call them this rather odd thing of flow, stock and returners. So the flow is the people that come onto the street, the stock are the people that remain on the street, returners are the people that return to the street, fairly obviously. And we record this and we do this by quarter. And we record this data by quarter and we look at the changing trends. Just to give you a sense of the scale, London has a rough sleeper population at the point of count of about 750. I'm looking at you, Hannah. Yeah, 750. But over the course of a year, there are about 7,000 entries onto the database. In fact, I think there were 7,800 entries onto the database last year. About 3,800 of those were only ever seen once, so they were removed from the streets. And in fact, only about 200 are really, really entrenched, so the people that stay on the streets for the full year and are seen, we call it seen, more than 20 times rough sleeping over the period of monitoring. So that's how we do the analysis. I couldn't get the dashboard onto the PowerPoint, so I apologise for that. But if anybody wants to see the main dashboard annual report, I've got it here. It's 42 pages long, but it has got lots of pictures and graphs in it. So do just come and get me at lunchtime and say, can I see your pictures and graphs? And I'll show them to you willingly, only pictures and graphs though. So that's how it's recorded. This is what's recorded on the database. So it's fairly straightforward. I think the thing to talk about most is the last bit, which is the support needs that's recorded onto the database. And we do have a reasonably detailed level of support needs on the database. So we record medical histories, we record drug and alcohol use, we record mental health problems in much the same way that that other people have noted. I mean, Bruno have the similar breakdown to what we have. The point I would make about it, and I think the thing that we really, really struggle with, is having the same definition quite often. So in another life, I used to work in mental health services. And one of the things that I always get is that people put people on the chain database and say they've got really high mental health needs. And it's actually because they've appeared really, really chaotically in front of them and do so on a regular basis. But actually, the mental health need isn't particularly high if you're a mental health worker or a mental health clinician and you're looking for a diagnosis. So the disconnect often between the different sectors is one of the key points here. And I think certainly in terms of pulling in the unusual suspects around Registry Week, that would be a really, really good thing to bottom out. Similarly, drug use is another one. So the number, I used to work in comorbidity, so I used to work with mental health and drug users. And again, people tell you about these absolutely terrible drug problems that people have. And of course, actually, it's partly because of the experience of the individual and how shocking that is to them, rather than if you actually did anything about rehab, you know these people would never even get to your rehab. So there's an understanding, I think, about definitions, and that's a really, really big issue for us. I want to talk a little bit about data protection, because I know that's the thing that comes up quite a lot. We have a range of agreements in place for it. There's a Data Protection Act. I think the Data Protection Act is actually European-wide, but then different countries and different places have different versions of the Data Protection Act. I'm guessing that in England or in Britain, we're fairly laissez-faire about it, because I don't think we really care. But we do have quite a lot of data protection issues to be mindful of. The key for us is that all of the organisations with access to chain, both read access and write access to chain, have to have a senior member of staff sign up to the agreement. So there's a corporate ownership of the responsibility of being part of the chain database network. And I've noted here, because it's particularly important, that it's the chief exec or the senior person signing up on behalf of all the staff they then allow onto the chain database. So the the organisations are then allowed to say, actually I need these 10 staff to go on, and Chain will do that for you, but it is your responsibility to do that as the organisation. And then it's the organisation's responsibility to ensure that their staff create that commitment around not disclosing information. Most importantly in all of that, we're really, really clear that it is a personal criminal offence to break that law. And I think that's probably the most important thing. You can have as many protocols as you like, and we're all used to signing protocols, and I don't know about you, but I tick terms and conditions boxes on things all of the time, and I've no idea what I've actually just ticked. So the important thing about this is not to get people just to tick the terms and conditions and go, yeah, I'm sure it'll be fine, but to actually understand the criminality and personal criminality that's involved in inappropriate sharing of data. And I think, unless Hannah you're going to say I'm wrong, I think that works. Actually, if you talk to our outreach teams in London and you talk to our service managers in London, they take this very, very seriously. So there is a real willingness to share information for the purposes of providing better services, but a real sensitivity then about not using that data badly. And I think it comes back to this very, very clear agreement right at the beginning, for us anyway. Obtaining consent is another issue, and we have a particular, we have a consent form that we ask clients to sign, and that makes it all sound really, really straightforward, doesn't it? So you happen to walk up to somebody on the street and you say, yeah, I want to put you on a chain, will you sign this consent form? And you happen to have one with you that's in pristine condition, and a pen, and a clipboard, and all of the things that you might need to get somebody to sign it. And of course they're fully sober, and they're prepared to read it, and they're prepared to sign it. Now you know and I know that that probably happens sometimes, but not all of the time. So it's everybody's responsibility to ensure we get consent. However, we understand that we can't always get written consent. Now obviously if we start sharing somebody's information around their, I don't know, their hepatitis C status or something, some very, very crucial information, we would need to get signed written consent to do that. But there are a number of ways that we record people without written consent. And it's really important for us to be able to do that, partly because it's practical. If there are 7,000 entries on the database, actually, practically, we need to make sure that we can keep updating them and keep putting people on. And secondly, the database is supposed to record everybody we see, not just the people that signed to be on it. It's not a club. It is a database that records the activity on the street. So we have to have ways around it. We've got a number of ways around it, two in particular. One is to receive verbal consent. Do you mind us asking you these questions? No, I don't mind. That's verbal consent. Now, as we grow to know those individuals and as we grow to know more detailed information, we log verbal consent and then seek written consent thereafter, particularly if we're taking very sensitive information and sharing it. So it's not to say that written consent isn't important, it's just not always practical on first interview. The other way that we don't necessarily ask clients for consent is when they're unable to give consent, but the information that we need, it's in their interest for us to have it and to share it. And there are particular legal definitions within the British data protection legislation that allow you to assess somebody as being vulnerable enough that the information that you're taking from them and then using is in their best interests, and that's not a choice they could have made. And the key is not a choice they could have made. So what you can't do is take somebody's information and use it and say, oh yeah, no, that was a really rubbish decision. And you know, the decision they was about to make was really rubbish. Because actually you're allowed to make rubbish decisions. And the issue is, was that person able to make that decision? So if you're somebody with a very, very complex mental health problem and you're self-medicating with heroin, for instance, and we're taking from you some information about your risk of blood-borne viruses that we want to share, we could say, well, actually, your risk both to yourself and to the public is greater than your need to have that information held confidentially, and that's not a decision that you can make either a good or bad one, because actually you've got a very severe mental health problem and you're medicating with a mind-altering substance that stops you from making a decision. So that's how we deal with consent. And like I say, obviously the best way to do it is to get somebody when they're sober sitting down and signing the form, including all of the agencies that you might want to share with, and we have an information sharing protocol sheet that people can also sign. But we do have ways around it, and we do recognise the need for practical ways around it that exist within the law. This is just some of the information that we've used the data for. So what we then do with the data is we take it and we use it, and I don't think we use it anywhere near as sophisticatedly enough. So actually I regularly sit in meetings where somebody comes with a report that looks like this thick, and it has 4 or 5 appendices to it that are also this thick, and then some smart arse comes with a different report with different data, cut in a different way, and there'll be 20 of us in a room, all scratching our heads going, I have no idea what this tells us. It's absolutely overwhelming, it's like an avalanche of data, and we don't ask the right questions. But we did use it to do a number of things. I just want to tell you a couple of things that we did use it to do. So actually, our No Second Night Out triage system was set up on the basis of our flow information. We could see the number of people coming onto our streets. We could see the number of people that weren't leaving after one night. We knew when they were coming, where they were coming, and we knew what the demand was, and we'd set up a service for it. That data's now changed, and we need to change that service, but nevertheless, we responded with using the data to the setup of a new service. Similarly, the 200 people that are always on the list, we can take those off the list, and we can have individual case conferences, borough by borough, to look at how we reduce that list. And we do that on a regular basis, on a quarterly basis. 2 members of my team with the Greater London Authority go and meet with the lead outreach workers and the local authority areas and say, what are you doing about John so-and-so? They're still on the list. How are we getting them off? And we've had some success with that. We use the information to do something called a social impact bond, which is where you pull private investment into services on the basis that you will achieve a better result than you have been doing previously, and you only get funded from the government on the basis of that result, and that's what allows you to pay the investment. It's terribly complicated, and it requires a data system underneath it to justify the investor payment. We were able to use chain as the basis for the investor payment. And finally, we use it to inform all of the borough strategies in London. And that's particularly the granular data, which is, again, boroughs sitting down and saying, actually, we've got 12 rough sleepers, here are their names, what do we do about it? We call that we call it tasking and targeting rather than case conferencing, largely. So that's how it is in action. I'm just going to talk briefly then about the other things that we do. So we do a point-in-time count. Westminster, one of the areas where we're thinking of doing the Register Week, actually does 4 point-in-time counts every year, 1 of which is the official count, 3 of which are intelligence counts, so just to see whether there's any trend. And the interesting thing about that, and the reason why I raise it here, is that the point-in-time count is really important because it stops the database just being a database of the people that you work with. And, we just ignore those people, or we didn't realise there was a hotspot over there. So it challenges the database and says, well, actually, when we walked every single street, we found more people. So that's just the other thing that we do, and just to let you know that. And then the final sort of other bit of data that we use in order to challenge chain is something called StreetLink. And StreetLink's quite a new system, it's been there for a couple of years, but this is the public reporting system. So one of the key principles of No Second Night Out in England is that members of the public must be able to do something about rough sleeping, and when we say do something, we would prefer them not to give rough sleepers money. And that's because actually in England, rough sleepers are all entitled to benefits, and actually begging is a way of entrenching people onto the streets, so that's certainly our belief. And so the homelessness system doesn't like it when members of the public give to beggars. Even sandwiches, sleeping bags, anything that maintains people on the streets, we generally don't like it. So StreetLink is our response to that, and it says actually with the push of a button on an app, or through the website, or through a phone line, you can say to the operator on the other end of the phone, I've just seen a rough sleeper, I've talked to that person, they've told me this, and what we will do is we will log that. It's logged in the central place. It then goes straight through to the local authority response, and a response goes, it's not an emergency service, I'm always told to say this is not an emergency service, so the response doesn't go within 20 minutes, but a response goes to that individual, and that feedback is given back to us, and if you want to, if you're on the app, you can request that feedback comes directly to you. So it's a way of creating public accountability for the bigger piece of work we do in ending rough sleeping. It's been interesting. It's funded by the Department of Communities and Local Government, and it's again run in partnership with ourselves and St Mungo's Broadway. Obviously, us and St Mungo's Broadway just do everything in Britain. So it's run by them. One of the interesting things to say about this, though, is that actually we thought we were really good at counting everybody. We thought Chain was really sophisticated and captured everybody and their needs and the list, and that we were brilliant. 74 people reported just in London on this that we'd never heard of. Didn't know they existed, didn't know anybody ever slept there. That's despite doing street counts. So that's the importance of not only having the by name database, but for us having a couple of other points that tell us where we've gone wrong or whether we're being complacent. A couple of the issues for us, I've been through them, so I won't go on about them too much. One of the issues for us is about real-time data. So I think one of the things that we're hoping to learn in terms of our journey into going towards a registry week, I don't think we do want to learn how to collect more data. We collect a lot of data. What we're really rubbish at is real-time data. So regularly we have to go through, not so much if you're the worker and you've got sight of the individual file, but certainly in terms of holding quite local communities to account in the here and now, as in last night there were this many people, why are they still there? Type data, we struggle with that. I think confidentiality and data sharing continues to be an issue for us. It continues to be an issue specifically, and I'm guessing it will be for some of the people in this room as well, as the demographic of rough sleepers changes and we see more issues in terms of migrant rough sleeping. And so one of the groups of people that regularly want sight of the data of the Chain database are the enforcement authorities. One of the things that the services then get really nervous about is that enforcement authorities can start looking at the profiles of the individuals that they serve. So there's a real issue about how widely we share data and to what level of granularness we can give data out, so it's still there. We have too much data. That's another issue for us, and I think it's really interesting, but one of the things I'd say that we've learned from doing all of this is that actually it's really useful to know what questions you're trying to answer before you start collecting all the data, because we regularly just have so much data that we can't see it anymore. And finally, changes to the data set. And that goes back to the bit about not really knowing the questions before you started collecting the data. So somebody then in the middle of the year says, I know, this would be really interesting to know, and then somebody puts it on the database. And actually, whilst it is really interesting to know, it's often then problematic in terms of the longitudinal nature of the database and the consistency for recording. So that's our experience in London, I think. I hope that's my last slide. Yes, that's our experience in London. I hope that was all right. And I think it's lunch. Is it lunch?
We've got time for a few questions.
I was told that I was the person between you and food, so I was really anxious to make sure that you weren't going to start trying to eat me alive on the said stage. But if there are any questions, I'm more than happy to take them, actually. Bull. Terrifying.
Can you talk about how Greater London got all or most of the service providers and others, either to agree or by decree to share data?
Could you repeat the question into the microphone?
I can. So Paul asked, how did we get people to agree to be part of the Chain database? And I think it's probably worth saying, actually, the Chain database has been around for a very long time, so it's at least 10 years old, if not 15. Yeah, so it's 15 years old, the database now. So it's been around a very long time. So actually, interestingly, and I would sort of say that this is probably the better learning curve, better learning point in some ways, is that actually we don't even think about that at all. Nobody sits in London, none of the services in London sit there saying, we shouldn't have a data shared, a shared access database. No, I've never heard anybody think it's a bad idea. It is so ingrained and so much part of our DNA in terms of the way that we deliver services. And if anything, actually most of the engagement around the chain database is largely around how can we improve it rather than how can we get rid of it. That said, it wasn't always like that, and back in the, the turn of the century, back in 2000, we didn't have the chain database. My understanding of this, and Hannah, I don't know if you were around at the time, you were. So my understanding of this is that we had a central government initiative called the Sleepers Union.